Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Leonarda, but many people often call me Lenny for short, and I'm from an Italian heritage on my dad's side of the family, hence my Italian name. I have lived in Washington State all my life, and I literally love it here, as it is indeed an idyllic part of the world to live, with year-round rather good weather and lots of indoor and outside activities, as well as ravishing views of silvery lakes, dreamy forests, very attractive-looking homes and colourful yards. I grew up here in an enchanting Italian-style symmetrical home with a great deal of Italianite influences, including a grey slate roof, large French windows and whitewashed walls, with stylised arches, pretty water fountains and a couple of Michelangelo-style statues. The front and back yards were covered in carpets of lush green grass and a scattering of pretty trees, not to mention colourful seasonal flowers in bloom, both in summer and spring. We also possessed a very large, sumptuous entertainment area in the backyard that overlooked a state-of-the-art, rather stunning-looking swimming pool. There was also a massive pizza oven for cooking melt-in-the-mouth Italian lamb flanks, and the best pizza that you've ever tasted in your life, made from a secret Italian recipe from my great-grandmother. Growing up, I was an only child, although I did have a half-sister from my dad's side of the family who was actually a nun and was now working in Uganda. My mother was my widowed father's second wife, and she was easily 20 years his junior. When I was about 13 years old, my dad tragically passed away very suddenly from a heart attack, and it was a very tumultuous, challenging time for my mother and I, as we had to adapt to life without the winsome personality and bewitching Italian charm of my father. Needless to say, I was fortunate enough to have a very privileged and blessed childhood, because my extraordinary mother pushed out all the stops to ensure that life was indeed very good for me. She literally went out on a limb to secure a well-paid job for herself as a legal secretary to offer us both a good standard of living from which we'd both grown accustomed. Even though she'd never worked for a day in her life before, she took the bit in her mouth, dived into the deep end like a champion, and never ever looked back. My story really begins when I was about 21 years old, in the January of 1996. I seem to recall that it was on a Saturday night that the snow began to fall, and in the neighbourhood where I lived, it was easily from 4 to 6 inches deep, if I remember well. It was late that night that I was going to be driving in these hazardous speculative conditions to my cousin's 21st birthday party, which was about 40 minutes away from where I lived. Many of my young friends had been invited. I was also considered a very careful, assertive and fastidious driver, and so I generously offered to give all 3 of my friends a lift, in less than favourable, rather treacherous conditions, to the very party in question. My mother had an ominous, foreboding feeling deep down in her gut about me driving in this tumultuous, unpredictable weather, but I put it all down to her being overly neurotic and influenced by too many alarming weather reports, warning people not to drive unless, of course, it was imperative or extremely pressing. Personally, I thought my cousin's 21st was indeed a mandatory occasion that could not be avoided, as you do indeed only turn 21 once in a lifetime. As a young man, I was not going to allow a little snowfall to ruin the lavish, wonderful party that my cousin had prepared, of which no expense had been prepared. It would seem that most of the youngsters were still going to attend the sleepover party, despite the somewhat dicey bad weather reports. On the contrary, we were going to make the most of the snowy conditions. So there we were, driving through the exquisitely beautiful winter wonderland of Washington State, where now carpets of thick snow covered the trees like dusty white icing sugar, and the white snow had enveloped the whole area in glorious blanketed fields of white, which was so dramatic, imposing, but incredibly magical, all at the same time. It was about 6 p.m. at night, and thankfully there weren't many cars out on the road because of the perilous, precarious conditions out there, and we began to drive amidst the animated laughter, happy chatting, and the music that was blaring from the radio. I was suddenly hit with this feeling of impending dread, and it was like a dark, menacing, ominous thundercloud in my gut, which was saying to me in a tiny little mouse-like voice, "Please don't go. Please don't go." I remember the anxiety seemed to heighten as I drove, because despite my excellent tyres, my grip on the road was not as smooth and plain sailing as I'd previously anticipated. I kept telling myself to stop being so gutless, as of course nothing bad was going to happen. Before long, everybody was talking excitedly about the party, as we would be staying at my cousin's house for a couple of days, and he had so many thrilling adventures planned up his sleeve. Also, the girl that I fancied like mad was already at his house, along with few of her very attractive girlfriends. On previous occasions I'd been too reticent and reserved to make her acquaintance, due to my crippling shyness and a desperate fear of rejection. Now I was more determined than ever that I was going to unleash my irresistible Italian charm upon her, that I was certain she would find impossible to resist. As I drove forwards, my thoughts were focusing on the very best chat-up lines to use on her, and I decided a touch of humour was definitely necessary. After all, girls liked it when you made them laugh. I pondered in my mind on the humorous chat-up lines I should use, like, "Are you from Tennessee? Because you're the only 10 I see." No, that sounded rather lame and a bit wishy-washy. How about, "I must be a snowflake, because I've fallen for you"? No, that didn't sound good either. "Do you like raisins? How do you feel about a date?" As I was reflecting upon all of this, my two friends in the back, Marco and Eddie, were singing to the radio music, which possessed a pleasing rhythmic beat, while Paul, who was in the seat next to me, appeared to be rummaging through my cubbyhole, looking for some bottled sweets. "Is this all you've got?" he complained. "I've never liked cherry flavour. Don't you have any pear drops? They're the best." I noticed we appeared to be driving through an unfamiliar, vast wooded area that seemed more off the beaten track than I'd previously realised. I wondered if I'd taken a wrong turning, or worse still, if I'd somehow lost my way. Should I have taken the right turning earlier on, I thought. On either side of the road were towering evergreen trees that literally stretched back for miles. Luckily, there'd only been a scattering of cars on the road, and I was glad to observe we were making steady progress and pretty good time. That was, of course, if I wasn't completely lost. For that moment I was not going to give that horrifying thought any consideration. "Where are we?" asked Marco. "I don't recognise this area at all. You do know where we're going, do you?" Of course I lied. "I know the way very well." I said this with a growing sense of unease, as I began to feel almost certain that I was definitely lost, but this was something that I wasn't prepared to share with my passengers at this present moment in time. Maybe I could surreptitiously turn around at the next turning. The deteriorating stormy weather conditions worsened every passing minute, as the tempestuous, fierce-pounding winds rattled fiercely against my car windows. Occasionally they blustered against my car so boisterously that it actually caused it to wobble. It was so dangerous, to the extent that I was almost afraid that the wind would actually lift my car off the road. That's how bad it was. As we drove up this hilly incline, my driving got even more problematic and troublesome as my car started slipping hazardously all over the place, and even my passengers were becoming heated, petulant, and very upset. "Man, this is freaking me out," came Marco's crabby voice that sounded heightened by anxiety. "Drive straight, man," he said. "You're sliding all over the place. You're doing my nut in. You can't play Russian roulette with our lives like this." "Look, I'm trying really hard," I said. "It's not easy, you know, to keep the car straight on the road. It seems like the road is slipping all over the place and my car's sliding everywhere. It seems as if my tyres are not gripping the road as they should." "Just be careful," came Paul's reassuring voice. "I'm sure we'll be fine. Just drive very carefully." Those were his famous last words, because as I drove along the narrow road, I suddenly observed the figure of a woman in white, standing there in the middle of the road, and she was staring straight at me with an airy look that sent shivers of dread down my spine. "What the heck?" I thought, trying to manoeuvre the car out of the way, because I'd have run straight over this woman if I hadn't. In a trice, my car tyres just lost their grip and went slipping, sliding and skidding to the edge of the rocky embankment, where my car just lifted off the road, literally like a bird in flight, and somersaulted over the guardrail, where it was flung violently backwards towards the valley below. It was situated on the edge of a heavy wooded area, and it rolled like an athlete doing a backwards flip, and crashed on the ground with an ear-piercing, thunderous thud. They say that your life flashes before you in those final moments of your life in a car wreck, and they're absolutely right about that. In that instant, I was more than certain that I was going to die, and I remember accepting my fate. Yet, even though everything happened so incredibly fast and quickly, it was as if time stood very still, almost as if someone had put the remote control on pause, as it would seem that every dreadful passing second lasted a lifetime. I wanted this all to be over as fast as possible. Finally, when the car did crash to the ground, everything became very noiseless and suddenly very quiet. I remember breathing a sigh of relief. I noticed everything in the car became deathly silent, and then it seemed I blanked out, and it was like I slipped into unconsciousness. I remember waking up to hear someone shaking the car very hard, causing it to rattle and wobble precariously. I could hear these strange chattering sounds that appeared to sound like a kind of monkey language, as if two people were engaged in a rather earnest conversation of some kind. It was all exceedingly bizarre and very peculiar. But I want to assure you, when you're slipping in and out of consciousness, you become strangely accepting of strange phenomena, much in the same way as you would in a dreamlike state. Suddenly I saw this large cone-shaped head with an angular face peering through the window at me. I opened my eyes ever so slightly to see these concerned-looking golden eyes staring intently at me. I then heard what I can only describe as an excited whoop and then a chatter as the creature began to realise that I was indeed alive. It seemed to be tugging violently at the mangled metal of my car, which he bent backwards with one of his overlong arms. Even though I was delirious, everything became incredibly surreal to me. But I do remember those overlong, powerful, strong, hairy arms pulling me out of my vehicle and laying me on the ground much further afield. I could hear banging, crashing, rattling sounds, as well as the continued chattering. It was not long before 3 more bodies were laid down beside me on the grass. It appeared that whatever these creatures were, they had rescued all of us. It was with relief that I could hear Paul and Marco let out a few uncomfortable groans. But Eddie remained deathly silent, and that scared the hell out of me. I remember looking up at the creatures that were staring down at us with rather perturbed, very earnest looks on their deep concerned faces. I noticed that these critters were colossal in size, like humanoid mountain giants, with ape-like influences, and they were covered in very dark flowing hair. I remember thinking that I'd never ever seen creatures like this before, and I wondered what in God's name they actually were. As I opened my eyes, One of the big hairy humanoids nudged me with his broad hand and began chattering away to me in a language I couldn't understand. He began to look into my eyes with such a loving warmth, as if to say everything will be all right, and I felt that in my gut, as if he'd actually spoken to me, as strange as that sounds. After that I remember nothing at all, as I drifted into unconsciousness and woke up in astonishment to find myself in a hospital bed, with only a few scars to account for my accident, along with a violently throbbing head, as I had naturally sustained a little concussion. It would seem that Eddie had been tragically killed in the accident, and that Marco was permanently crippled for life, but the two of us that had been seated in the front of the car had actually escaped with our lives intact, and we were no worse for wear, apart from the inevitable bruises, scrapes, cuts, and a little concussion, obviously. As you can imagine, I blamed myself for the car wreck, and Marco's parents naturally accused me of negligent driving and causing their son's crippled condition. I couldn't blame them for feeling this way, because I felt wholly responsible for everything. This whole horrifying fiasco ultimately caused my mother to have a serious nervous breakdown, where she ultimately needed shock treatment because she blamed herself for letting me venture out in those crazy wintry conditions. Eddie's parents were much more forgiving towards me, even though they had tragically lost their son, and they told me not to blame myself for what had transpired that fateful night. I was the one that was tougher on myself than anybody else could have been, and my own worst judge, as I was unable to forgive myself for what had happened to two of my very best friends. For a long time my memories of the woman in white on the road and the strange creatures that had pulled us out of the car seemed rather like a hazy blur, and I believed I'd imagined it all. "You mustn't blame yourself for what happened," said Paul. "If that strange woman in white hadn't been in the middle of the road, we would have all been fine. You had to avoid running her over, and you had to swerve, and that's why the car flipped over the embankment, because it was precariously slippery on that road. Don't you remember?" "You saw her too," I said, looking at him with a shocked expression on my face. "I saw her," said Paul, "but I did wonder if she was actually real." "What do you mean real?" I asked. "Well, don't you think there was something ethereal and rather spooky about her?" he asked me. "You think she was a ghost?" I asked my friend in horror. "Well, it's a distinct possibility," he said, "but you can't ever be sure about that. Yet if she wasn't, why was she standing in the middle of the road in a flimsy cotton white dress in the middle of winter?" "Good point," I said. "I'd never thought about that before." Paul looked at me with an awkward expression on his face, as if he wanted to say something, but was rather reluctant to do so. "Did you see them?" he asked me. "See what?" I asked. The hairy creatures that pulled us out of the car after we crashed. They looked like giant apes with hair. Do you remember them?" "You saw them too?" I asked. "I thought it must have been a dream." "No, it was real," said Paul. "They were real." He then told me that our bodies would not have been discovered so quickly if a piece of very heavy metal from the car accident hadn't been placed in the middle of the road. I think those creatures put it in the road to draw attention to the accident so the police would search for the rest of the vehicle, which meant they would have found our car at the bottom of the embankment, which would have easily been overlooked, and we could have spent the rest of the night out in those freezing conditions. Something or someone had literally covered our bodies in branches to keep out the freezing weather. I gather one of the officers didn't understand why a large piece of our crashed car was actually lying in the middle of the road, and why all four of us were lying next to each other outside the accident scene, covered in branches. It was only years later that I was to discover that the creatures that had rescued us that night were in fact Bigfoots, but my story doesn't end there, as you might expect. 30 years later, when I was married and my wife was already at work, and I was sleeping in later that morning, as I had been working night shift, I woke to find a man standing at the end of my bed with a balaclava over his head and a revolver in his hand that he was wobbling precariously and very dangerously. Naturally, I thought I was in a dream, because you never ever imagine somebody holding a rifle to your head. It happens in the movies, but not really in real life. "I'm going to kill you," he said. "You deserve to die." I noticed that the voice sounded very tearful and distressed, and I should have been utterly terrified, having a revolver in my face, but the person behind the balaclava sounded much like my son. "What's going on?" I asked. "Who are you?" To my astonishment, the young man pulled off his balaclava, and I was staring at a 13-year-old boy who looked very distressed and anguished, and his blue eyes were filling with tears. "I'm Marco's son, the one you crippled for life in that accident. Do you remember?" I looked at the young man, and my eyes flooded with tears. This was the first time I'd physically really cried over that accident. But seeing this young boy like this brought on the emotions, and they rose up and just poured out of my eyes. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I said. "How is your father these days?" "Like you care," said the boy. "My dad is dead, thanks to you. The doctors concluded it's all connected to his crippling condition, which is why he died, and it's all your fault, because you caused the crippling in the first place." "I don't know what to say," I said to the young man. "I'm so sorry. There's not a day that doesn't go by that I don't really regret what happened." The young boy dropped the gun to the ground, which I found out later had never been loaded. He began to weep and weep, and I took him into my arms, and we both cried together for a very long time, and the tears really did help bring about healing for both of us. "How old are you?" I asked him. 13, he said. "I lost my father at your age. I know exactly what you're going through." Shortly after that experience, I made amends with Marco's family, and now his wife and son visit us regularly for social engagements, and it seems that these interactions have been very healing for all of us. I always regret the day I did not listen to my gut instinct or the warning voice of my mother telling me not to go. Nowadays, if the conditions are bad out there, I prefer never to take the risk of driving in treacherous snowy conditions, because no matter how safely you drive, things can quickly get out of control. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Matthew and I'm from Seattle in Washington, and my remarkable, incredulous story began shortly after my great-uncle Huck passed away of a heart attack. This was on his small cattle ranch east of the Cascades in Washington. It would appear that he had left his sizable estate to my father in his will, which included his small cattle ranch. This all happened in 2011, when I was about 11 years old at the time. This prodigious gesture of extravagant generosity on my great-uncle's part surprised my dad, as he had never expressed an interest in raising cattle before, and he'd only ever visited the ranch a handful of times as a young boy to play with his cousin Donovan. Very sadly, Donovan's mother had died of bowel cancer when he was only 8 years old, and so Donovan grew up to be his father's blue-eyed boy. Unfortunately, Donovan, my great-uncle's only son, should have inherited the cattle ranch from his dad, but had tragically been killed in a horse-riding accident 5 years prior when he went flying off a horse and crashing and colliding onto a rocky ridge. After his tragic death, as you can imagine, my great-uncle was never really the same again, because a deep depression hung over his life like an oppressive dark thundercloud. He sought solace and comfort from the lonely emptiness he regularly experienced by talking to his cows, because they never answered him back, and he always felt in some bizarre way that they almost commiserated with him over the compounding grief that he suffered in his life. According to a good friend of Huck's, he really believed that his cows understood him. So it was that my family made the decision to move to the ranch for the summer holidays. That was to decide what was to be done about the place, as selling up seemed almost unthinkable, given how much blood, sweat and tears that my great-uncle had invested in the place over the years. I remember that momentous, memorable day as if it was yesterday. That was the day that I first laid eyes on this heavenly ranch, and it was just so breathtakingly beautiful to behold. I couldn't believe it. There were open pastures for rotational feeding, and there were mountainous valleys, rugged outcrops, and pretty little country roads. There was a sparkling silvery lake that was flanked by a dreamy statuesque forest of mature imposing trees that had been superbly preserved by my great-uncle. It was so incredible that this outstanding, impressive property was all ours, and my shaggy golden retriever sensed that. Lassie was literally over the moon about this brand new, exciting adventure of ours. I laughed as I watched her darting everywhere, smelling every available piece of turf, and lifting her leg on everything that she could possibly mark. It was as if she was saying, "Watch out, I'm in Eastern Washington, and get used to it, because I'm making my presence known, and I'm marking my new auspicious territory." Lassie also adored swimming in the lake, while I would throw sticks for her to catch, and I could tell that if Lassie had her way, she would gladly make the cattle ranch her brand new home. And much to my amazement, she had even managed to befriend the cows. The grand ranch-style home with its grey roof and whitewashed walls was exceedingly attractive and in a very good state of repair. It was a quintessential two-storey home with all the bedrooms situated upstairs and the first floor devoted to open-plan living, where the kitchen seamlessly blended into the living and dining quarters of the home without any restrictive partitions, which meant that the whole dwelling was both sumptuous, cosy, spacious, airy and light. There were gorgeous large stone fireplaces in the living area, comfortable family-sized couches scattered with pretty colourful cushions, glass coffee tables layered with interesting-looking books, and a very large oak dresser superbly displayed with blue and white Royal Doulton china plates and accessories, giving the whole space a shabby chic kind of look. There were large stylish windows along the front of the house, as well as seamless glass sliding doors that pulled back to reveal a generously sized covered patio area that overlooked magnificent panoramic views over the evergreen trees that flanked the sparkling jewel-like lake. It would seem that no expense had been spared on kitting out the patio with state-of-the-art barbecue equipment, not to mention a fridge and a bar, and even a pizza oven, if that wasn't enough. "It's so beautiful," gasped my mother. "I'd love to live here permanently." "Not so fast, honey," said my father, kissing her on the cheek. "I don't know the first thing about running a ranch, and frankly I'm not sure if I'm cut out for the job. It looks dauntingly overwhelming for me." "Don't be so hard on yourself, dear," said my mother. "You can turn your hand to anything and make it work. I know you could." At that moment there was a knock at the door, and standing in the doorway was a rather stylish-looking older gentleman. He was wearing a cowboy hat and boots, along with a pair of Levi jeans, with a zooty leather belt, adorned with an oversized, rather ornate-looking buckle that was embossed with an engraving of a large bull upon it. He was wearing a stylish, rather debonair white cotton shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows. In my opinion, he bore a striking, uncanny resemblance to Clint Eastwood, with the whole cowboy look going on. The slender, athletic, strong body, the rugged, weathered complexion, and the white hair. "Howdy there," he said. "I'm Abel, and I was Huck's farmhand. I'm dreadfully sorry for your loss," he said, reaching out to shake all of our hands. "So lovely to meet you," my mother interjected. "We're going to need all your help running this ranch. We've not got the first clue how to get started." "That's what I'm here for," he said. "I know all of the ropes, so I'll teach you everything you need to know about the cows. Must have been a big shock for you, inheriting the ranch out of the blue like this, with all the cows, chickens and horses to boot. It's tough for city folks to get the hang of the country, but you'll learn quickly enough. That's a promise." "Oh, believe me, I'm going to need all the help I can get," said my father. "I'm still trying to get my head around it all." "Luckily he didn't suffer," said Abel, as he began to talk about my great-uncle. "He was out there feeding the cows, and then I saw him fall over, and he was a goner, just like that. Died the way he wanted to go, with his beloved cows. He loved those animals like they were his children, you know." "Well, that's a good thing," said my mother. "I mean that he died so peacefully." "He knew he was going to die," said Huck reflectively. "I thought he was talking baloney at the time, when he told me to look after this place and his cows for him, when he was gone. Naturally, I asked him what the heck he was on about, because he was so healthy at the time. He said he'd seen a vision of his son Donovan in a dream, you know. His son was riding on horseback under the sun towards the rocky ridge where he actually had that terrible accident. And he said, 'Dad, I'm coming to get you soon,' and then cantered away on his horse. He believed the dream because he said it was that vivid. Not like other dreams, he told me." "Wow," said my father, "that's extraordinary. It's almost like a premonition." "You could say that," said Abel. "There were a few strange things happening around here over the years, but that's a whole other story. I do need to inform you, though, that we have been having a few problems with wolves trying to attack cows in the area, although fingers crossed it hasn't happened here on our ranch yet. From what I gather, Fish and Game are not much of a help either, as they seem much more intent with saving the wolves and not our cows, which is a hell of a shame if you ask me. I mean, the cows are our livelihoods around here." "What are you going to do about it?" asked my father in horror. "Well, I keep the cows enclosed in the rotational pasture land for their own protection, so they're not free to wander as they please. The problem is that the pole fences won't stop the wolves from getting into the cows, but at least they're contained, so we can be alerted if they're attacked. Some of the big ranches in the area have lost cows to these sporadic wolf attacks, and they've been getting worse lately. It seems that the wolves aren't even scared of the humans, so it's an increasing worry for all the ranch owners out here. Anyway, I'll leave you to get settled in," he said, lifting his cowboy hat off his head very briefly in a gesture of friendliness and walking away. "Wolves," said my father. "Who would have thought they'd be a problem on a cattle ranch? I hope they stay away from here, because I'm not sure I could handle fighting off creatures like that on a ranch." "Maybe they're breeding too much," I suggested, "especially if they're being protected." "Good point, son," said my father. "Too much of anything causes problems. Like too many hogs cause environmental damage. And even though I like wolves, it seems they're getting out of hand in the area, and I hope Fish and Game do something about it and just don't sit on their laurels and do nothing." Before long, my family settled down and adapted to ranch life quite happily, and we really began to enjoy our whole new experience of living here on the ranch. I was helping my dad with the cattle, and I really warmed to the creatures, because believe it or not, cows are really rather nice. I even caught my father talking to them once, so I think he was beginning to appreciate the great outdoors, but was very reluctant to admit it. I'd also been riding with Abel over the ravishing, beautiful countryside, and he'd been teaching me all the ropes on how to run a cattle ranch smoothly. I would spend ages with Abel riding on the back of my horse, feeling its hooves trotting along the country lanes or the grassy turf beneath me, and enjoying the feeling of the gentle breeze blowing against my face, as well as taking in all these gorgeous panoramic views of the countryside like a delicious sweet nectar. The garrulous Abel told me so many stories about my great uncle that were so fascinating that I hung on to his every word. As we were trotting along a country road with Lassie, my golden retriever, tottering behind us with her bushy tail wagging profusely, Abel began to tell me the most extraordinary story that I'd ever heard. "One time," he continued, "we found 2 dead bodies over there in the woods," he said, pointing to the wooded area that flanked the pristine-looking silvery lake that gleamed in the mid-morning sun and reflected the trees and fluffy clouds on its surfaces like a mirror. "What?" I gasped. "Human bodies?" "They were human, all right, clearly trespassing on our land, but the bodies had been killed, mutilated and mauled in a very despicable fashion." "When did this happen?" I asked. "Oh, that was about 30 good years ago," he said. "How were they killed?" "Well, their heads had been brutally and violently twisted off their necks, much like a chicken head, and the eyes had been removed from the hollowed sockets, and the arms had been literally ripped off the bodies. Let me assure you, it was the most ghastly, grisly, catastrophic, and most gruesome sight that I have ever witnessed in my entire life. It was horrifying," he said. "It would have taken something monstrously big to tear off a human limb like that, much like you or I tearing off a cooked piece of turkey breast away from the carcass. It was like that." "But who could have done such a heinous, appalling thing?" I asked. "Well, your uncle was convinced it was a Bigfoot, although at the time no one knew what a Bigfoot was, so Huck kept his mouth firmly sealed, because he knew people would think he was absolutely loopy if he suggested a hairy humanoid ape was responsible for the erroneous, bizarre deaths." "You see," Abel continued, "the authorities believed it was a bear attack. Now, I assure you, a bear doesn't kill a human being like that, and they know it. The only thing it could have been was a Bigfoot. It couldn't have been anything else." "A Bigfoot?" I asked, looking dumbfounded. "But are those things even real?" "Oh, they're real, all right," snapped Abel. "Your uncle saw one in those woods over there, shortly before the harrowing, deadly incident occurred. I believed him. Your uncle never told a pork pie a day in his life, let me tell you. I remember it was on a Sunday morning when your great-uncle took his German long-haired pointers Biscuit and Poppy for a lazy ramble in the woods. He said his dog suddenly became incredibly enthused, excited and energized and began to bark continually at something that your uncle couldn't actually see. Whatever they were barking at was something that was very pleasing to them. Then your great-uncle suddenly saw a movement in his peripheral vision that looked like a shadowy form in the undergrowth. Once the creature knew it had been seen, it rose from its crouched position and stood up on its two powerful long legs, shielding half of his Herculean-sized body behind a tree trunk, with one overlong arm wrapped around it. Huck said the creature just stared at him with those bright golden eyes, and he said he was so unsettled because it was as if the creature was literally looking through his soul. He said that his heart began to pound violently in his chest like a heavy drum, and it was so thunderously hard he could actually hear it. He said he was so paralysed by fear because this thing was colossal and was covered in shaggy dark brown hair. At the time, your great-uncle did not know what on earth it was and described it as a giant humanoid ape. Was it aggressive towards him, I asked. No, not at all. That's the absurd thing, said Ape. The critter seemed gentle and rather curious, and even his German pointers seemed unusually gregarious and good-natured towards the critter, which was the most peculiar thing of all. It was as if they were familiar and well acquainted with the beast. Biscuit literally bounded over to the hairy critter and jumped up and down on him like he was welcoming an old friend, and the critter patted the dog affectionately, almost as if he knew him well. Now those dogs slept outside watching the cows at night, so maybe they had met the curious critter before. Your uncle reprimanded Biscuit severely and told him to get back here. Those dogs were incredibly obedient and loved the bones off your great-uncle, but they seemed reluctant and hesitant to say goodbye to their hairy friend, whom let's just say they appeared to really like. Your uncle ran as fast as he possibly could back to the house because he was so terrified. He told me it was the toughest, most grueling and challenging run of his entire life because his legs failed to cooperate and felt like blocks of cement beneath him. I remember him telling me that his adrenaline that had been coursing through his veins had been of no use whatsoever to him in increasing his speed because his running had been laborious and laboured, almost as if he was treading water. He was so scared he looked as white as a ghost and his eyes were as wide as saucers, and he said, "Abel, I've just seen a colossal monster in the woods, and can you believe it? My dogs actually liked the thing." Well, I asked, if the creature was as gentle as you say, why did Great-Uncle Huck believe the Bigfoot murdered those people in such a barbaric way? Huck was certain no one else could have perpetrated that grisly crime. It was the way they were killed, you see. Who else could have possibly killed those people like that? Who has the strength to twist a human neck like a chicken? Did they ever find out the identities of those trespassers that were killed? I asked curiously. Well, yes, that was where the story gets interesting, because the authorities discovered that many missing cows had mysteriously vanished in the area, had actually been stolen by these two men. So your great-uncle was convinced those men were scouting his ranch with nefarious motives, with the full intention of stealing a few cows. It would make sense because they were carrying rifles and binoculars at the time, including a notebook that contained timetables of detailing the movements on our farm. After that startling revelation, Huck felt a lot less sympathetic towards the two dead men who had lost their lives so treacherously and in such a gruesome way. You see, those cows were his life, so you don't mess with a rancher's cows. Ask any rancher about that. They take it very personally, you know. Could the Bigfoot have possibly been protecting the cows, I suggested. Maybe he sensed that the men were up to no good. Your Uncle Huck came to the very same conclusion and began to believe that the Bigfoot was territorial and protective towards the ranch and its animals. So actually he warmed to the Bigfoot but never saw it again because they're very elusive creatures by nature. That's why they're not rarely documented by science. Wow, I said, that's some story. Little was I to realise at the time that I would have a story all of my own to tell that was also extraordinary. It all happened when my golden retriever Lassie, that sleeps at my feet, began to growl furiously at the end of my bed one night. I noticed that her ears were pinned right back, and her tail was thumping and hanging between her legs. I immediately knew something was very wrong, and the first thing I thought about was the safety of the cattle, and so I quickly grabbed my dad's hunting rifle and raced out of the front door as fast as I could towards the pasture where the cows were grazing. Sure enough, I could see that the cattle were terribly flustered. They were mooing earnestly, and there were several grey wolves stealthily moving in on one of the smaller cows as they hankered beneath the poled fencing and crept cautiously closer and closer to their intended victim. To my absolute horror, Lassie bounded towards the wolves and started barking at them fearlessly. But she was outnumbered by these creatures, and then they circulated her and began to growl, and one leapt forward and lunged over my dog, pinning her onto the ground. That was my worst nightmare, unravelling before my very eyes. I was about to lose my precious dog. Everything seemed to be happening in slow motion, and every second seemed to last a lifetime. My heart was pounding violently in my chest, and my fingers were clumsily trying to straighten my rifle to aim at the wolf. But I was so terrified of shooting my dog by mistake. Suddenly I saw him emerging out of the shadows, and to my amazement it was a Bigfoot. I could hardly believe it. I was so stunned. This creature was as fast as greased lightning, and he came to my dog's rescue in a miraculous second. I promise you his movements were so swift that an unloaded bullet from a rifle would fail to compete. He bounded towards the wolf, and his mouth curled back to reveal a large set of human teeth, and he unleashed the most horrifying roar that was so thunderous and so terrifying it caused the ground to shake and wobble beneath me. My whole body literally trembled with terror. In a trice this creature had lifted the wolf that was on top of Lassie and tossed it into the air like a frisbee, where it landed on the ground with a heavy thump. He twisted its neck so violently that the head was turned to face the opposite direction, which looked seriously macabre. I promise you, this wolf looked like a tiny puppy in the gargantuan hands of the monstrous beast. The wolves were so petrified they started to make whimpering sounds as they retreated backwards, watching their friend succumbing to its deadly fate. This Bigfoot grabbed another wolf and killed it with the same violent momentum and deadly sequence, and the rest of the wolf pack fled away in absolute terror, making some strange whimpering sounds, with their hair on their coats quite literally doubling in size, much like a cat's does when it's frightened. It was extraordinary. Lassie came bounding towards me, so delighted to have been rescued, because she knew her life had been spared. I couldn't believe that she barely had a scratch on her. I knew if the Bigfoot hadn't reacted so swiftly, Lassie would most certainly have been dead. Once the wolves had gone, the Bigfoot looked at me for a moment, and his golden eyes seemed both congenial and very warm. I nodded to the Bigfoot and said thank you, and I know this sounds weird, but I'm certain he understood me. I noticed the Bigfoot possessed the typical cone-shaped head that is so often described, and it seamlessly blended into his shoulders without any evidence of a neck. It was covered in long, shaggy grey hair, with areas of white, and his leathery skin on its oval worm-like face was very weathered and shriveled, and also quite wrinkled, and I really got the impression that this wizened creature was quite long in the tooth. To my amazement, Lassie assuredly went bounding up to the hairy creature, as she knew that it had indeed saved her life, and her gratitude was immense. The large hand of the Bigfoot cradled her head and gently stroked her body. I noticed that the critter was missing 2 fingers on one of his hands. I watched in astonishment as Lassie rubbed her body against the creature's strong, powerful legs, very affectionately, as if she was almost laying claim to him. I want to stress that Lassie is a devoted, doting and tender-hearted dog, but she can be wary and reticent of strangers, and is only friendly to those she trusts. It's rare for her to display such warmth to a complete stranger, so I was flabbergasted and rather astonished. I would say that this Bigfoot was easily 9 foot tall, 800 pounds and 3 foot wide, and was clearly built for power, speed and strength. Put it this way, he was intimidating and scary, but his powerful demeanour contradicted his foreboding appearance, and although he killed those wolves in such a savagely brutal way, In reality, he was really a rather gentle giant who was seemingly rather protective to both my dog and the cows, which was so commendable. I mean, who wouldn't want that? I noticed that while all this was transpiring, some rather interested, curious cows were watching everything that was occurring with wide, curious eyes and a very eager interest. They didn't seem afraid of the Bigfoot for some strange reason, which rather suggested to me that this was not their first encounter with the hairy humanoid, and that they weren't uncomfortable with his appearance at all. At this point, I'd like to mention that I never smelt that hot garbage smell that is often associated with a Bigfoot sighting. For me, the creature smelt a little like my wet dog, but that never offends me. Suddenly I heard my father walking towards the front door, and in that instant the Bigfoot threw both wolves, one over each shoulder, much like a big dangling furry scarf, and gracefully glided away at lightning speed, clearly not wanting to be observed by my father. "What's going on?" asked my dad. "I'm sure I heard some noises. Are the cows all right? It's not the wolves, is it?" he asked, looking apprehensive. He was half asleep, wearing his dressing gown and slippers, and looked very tired. "Why was Lassie barking so much?" he continued, "and making such a raucous commotion?" "Everything's fine," I assured him. I knew if I told my dad what had actually happened, he would have overreacted and might have chosen to sell my great-uncle's ranch, claiming that dealing with a Bigfoot and a bunch of wolves was far more than he could ever handle. I didn't want him to have the perfect excuse to concede defeat. My father was often quick to doubt himself, even though he was a man of many talents and accomplishments. My mother was always the one to make him see sense and give him a nudge in the right direction. I was enjoying living here so much on the cattle ranch. I was not going to tell him anything because I had a vested interest in staying here. I also felt so connected with the cows and the land. I had developed a deep longing in my heart to become a rancher one day, as this intriguing, idyllic, inspirational, wholesome lifestyle seemed as natural as breathing to me. The last thing I wanted was to return to our humdrum, monotonous, and seemingly dreary lives back in the city. Even my studious mother was loving life on the ranch, and my father just needed a little more persuading to convince him to jack in his tediously boring job in the city as a chartered accountant to become a fully fledged cattle rancher. You see, I was exceedingly confident knowing that that remarkable, protective and rather loyal Bigfoot was ensuring that both the cows and my dog Lassie were indeed in safe hands. I was to find out that I was very right, because many ranchers in the Washington area had ongoing wolf attacks on their cows, but it would seem the wolves have left ours alone, thanks to the Bigfoot that was always on patrol. When I confided in Abel about what had transpired that night, and how Bigfoot had miraculously rescued Lassie from the wolf attack, I mentioned that the hairy ape-like humanoid that I encountered was actually missing 2 digits on one of his hands. Imagine the surprise I got when Abel informed me that he had failed to mention that the Bigfoot my great-uncle Huck had observed was also missing 2 digits on his hands. So the Bigfoot had clearly lived on this land for over 30 years and had grown accustomed to the daily routines of ranch life. It would seem that the Bigfoot has succumbed to the ravages of age and the environmental hazards of a hard lifestyle, for over the years his dark brown hair has receded and grown grey. It would seem that this extraordinary critter really loves dogs and even cows that he watches over, and he succeeded in protecting them all. I ask you, what better guard could you possibly have? I've heard rather terrible stories about Bigfoots before, such as you cannot trust them and that they're exceedingly dangerous. I can't make any comments about other people's experiences, but only comment about mine. I can only ascertain that some are good and others bad. It's literally as straightforward as that, I imagine. Fast forward a few years, and the good news is that my father settled down to become a great cattle rancher, and can't even fathom how he stuck it out for so long behind a desk in a city office, because like me, he adores the fresh air and the sunshine. And boy, he is a good rancher, even if I say so myself. He told me once that my great-uncle had actually appeared to him in a dream and said, "Well done, son. I knew I could trust you to take care of my cows." My father said the dream seemed so real, and after that event his confidence in running the ranch literally skyrocketed. I've caught him on many occasions still having lengthy discussion with the cows over the oddities of life. As for the Bigfoot, I haven't actually seen him of late, but I know he's around. I can sense him. Recently I uncovered a few 16-inch tracks in the ground. Also at night I've often heard among the sounds of the crickets and frogs the occasional whooping sound, and my mother firmly believes it sounds like a primate. I shan't be telling her the truth, or how right she actually is. Sadly, Abel did die about 5 years ago, but I'm so thankful he taught me how to become a fine rancher. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Julia and I'm from West Virginia and have lived in this idyllic part of the world all my life. And my Bigfoot encounter happened to me in the summer of 1993, when I was about 39 years old at the time. My story rarely begins when my husband and I began trying for a baby, but I just seemed unable to fall pregnant. And that was when we invested in a series of fertility treatments. But unfortunately, every single round failed to take for us. And when I did actually fall pregnant, it ultimately ended in a miscarriage with every single implantation. After every failed pregnancy, I remember being so heartbroken, discouraged, and devastated that there were times I felt so flat and hopeless that I even considered ending it all. You see, the depression was so overwhelming for me. From the moment I got up in the morning, it was like this black looming thundercloud hung over my life, like an unwelcome friend with an oppressive heaviness that seemed to suck the life out of my soul. I really felt so empty and so emotionally drained that I became numbed by the grief. It was hard to feel anything at all. My husband was equally as traumatized because he longed for a family almost as much as I did. After excessive expenditure and extreme heartbreak, it would seem the endless round of fertility treatments were just not worth the effort nor the expense, and we called a halt to all the procedures because nothing was working, and I felt like a hamster on a treadmill going around and around in circles all the time, but never ever getting anywhere. One day my husband suggested that we tried for a surrogate, and before long we found the perfect young woman who claimed that she would be a willing surrogate mother for us, because she was desirous to help childless couples. But on reflection, I'm almost certain it was her way to make extra and easy money. Not that being pregnant is easy, of course. The young girl was about 28 years old and married with 7 kids of her own, and she had already sired 2 children for successful surrogacies. So my husband and I felt certain that we were on to a winner here, and so before long, this young lady was pregnant with our baby, and I was absolutely over the moon. Every time the baby kicked in her belly, it was like it was kicking in my belly, and with every passing day my excitement escalated. Our surrogate mother was not shy in coming forward about all the expenses that she claimed we needed to cover, like her ravenous cravings for expensive food items and all the supplements that she invariably needed during her pregnancy, such as folic acid. But we agreed to pay for absolutely everything, as we wanted more than anything else to have this baby. My husband and I moved to a beautiful house in Charleston, West Virginia, in a green leafy suburb, and we immediately prepared a nursery for our new addition to the family, which I discovered was going to be a little boy that I would choose to call David. I turned the nursery into a cosy den, and I had the wall painted in sea themes with dolphins, seahorses, seals and whales painted all over the walls. One day we received the very exciting call that our surrogate child had been born at 12 a.m. on October the 8th, weighing 7 pounds and 6 ounces. The birth had been quick and efficient without any complications, and my kid had a pair of good lungs on him because he let out a very loud cry. I remember feeling this incredible joy filling every cell of my body with a tingling warmth I would never be able to describe to you. As we got close to the hospital, my heart was fluttering enthusiastically and I was nervously excited. I kept saying to my husband, "We're going to be parents!" and I could not wipe the Cheshire-sized grin on my face because I had been waiting for this amazing moment all my life, and now the time had come to be introduced to my brand new baby. I could hardly wait. When I arrived at the hospital, my husband and I were told to leave immediately, as the mother of our child did not want to see us at all. We were told by the medical staff there that our surrogate mother had chosen to keep the baby after all. There are no words to describe my grief, as I was filled with utter and total despair. How could this have happened to me? Why was she so intent on keeping our baby when she had been willing to be a surrogate to other parents and had freely given them their babies, but she wasn't giving us ours? I remember feeling the kind of insurmountable loss you feel when you grieve over a tragic passing of someone you really loved. I felt as if someone had beaten the life out of me like a boxer with a punching glove, pounding me again and again to the point that I was literally struggling to breathe. It felt exactly like that. A few days later, the surrogate's husband knocked at our door, telling us that if we paid several $100,000 to them, then the surrogate mother would change her mind and be willing to sign the legal papers so that we would be the legal parents for our baby. I know it was duplicitous blackmail born out of a gargantuan greed, but we would have done anything at that point to get the baby, and we were fortunately able to afford it, although it did mean getting into a little debt. But nothing was more significant to us than having this baby that we had hankered after for so very long. After that arduous ordeal, I'm glad to say that I had no more problems from that surrogate mother again, which was a very real dread of mine that hung over my life for a long time, because I was petrified that the mother was going to kidnap our baby. Needless to say, my child David was growing up to be the most adorable child who looked remarkably like my husband, but he had two terrible crippling phobias. One was spiders and the other irrational fear was clowns. Two fears that uncannily hounded my husband's life when he was a young boy growing up, and clearly the same bizarre and peculiar fear had been inherited by our own child. One day when my son saw a clown at a shopping centre, he was so petrified that he ran through the shopping centre over towards a busy road that was bursting with afternoon traffic, and he bounded across the road and narrowly missed being run over by a bus. But luckily the vigilant bus driver stopped in time and literally got off the bus and dragged my son into it for safety. Seeing this event unfold before my very eyes put the fear of God into my heart, as it was unthinkable to lose my son. I was so disturbed that a comical clown could cause my son so much distress. I asked him why clowns terrified him, and he could not articulate to me why these creatures of comic were so disturbing to him. Yet I will say this to you, that my own husband to this very day cannot see a clown without breaking out into a huge sweat. It seems irrational and crazy, but it's a real phobia to some people, which makes no sense to me at all. One day David was invited to a 7th birthday party at his friend's house in the West Virginian countryside, and this house was utterly exquisite. I have no words other to describe it. It was one of the breathtaking houses that I've ever seen in my entire life, and it was nestled in the heart of the emerald green valley like a sparkling precious jewel. It was a remarkable piece of Georgian architecture, with a symmetrical facade and red brick walls, double-hung windows with about 12 lights in every sash, a large white panelled door with pilasters and dental mouldings in the cornice. Now, if that wasn't enough, there was a superb, extended, generous entertainment area which was much more modernised but did not undermine nor subdue the historic integrity of the house. There were also idyllic gravel paths and geometrical shaped hedges, as well as pretty white roses in the terraced garden. There was also a grandiose sandstone pathway that led through an arched facade to the elaborate front door. It was the panoramic views around this home that literally took my breath away, as the sea of never-ending verdant grass stretched back for miles, dotted with a scattering of trees and a beautiful silvery lake that was surrounded by a dense area of natural woodland that I gather was teeming with indigenous wildlife. Everywhere you looked in the distant horizon you would see statuesque mountains and trees, and it was so ravishingly beautiful, and I felt very envious that my host lived in such a gorgeous, sumptuous retreat. David was incredibly excited about this party, and all the mothers were invited as well. We bustled around the kitchen together, talking about our kids, while at the same time warming up pizza slices and sausage rolls, while we placed bowls of party snacks onto trays and laid them out on the table, where they were greatly received by a hungry bunch of girls and boys. The party boy's father was cooking burger patties and frankfurters on the barbecue outside. It was a festive atmosphere, and everybody was exceedingly happy. The children were all animated and excited, and there were shrieks and happy cries of laughter from all the kids. As the day progressed, everything went exceedingly well, with party games like Pass the Parcel, musical chairs, and Blind Man's Buff were played. This was followed by a huge birthday cake that was shaped into a steam engine and covered in colourful candies, and it was lighted up for the birthday boy. It was then that, out of the blue, our host announced that she had a big surprise for her son. And that was then out came the clown. In that moment, I completely forgot my son's dreadful, paralysing fear of clowns, and I giggled as the man with the oversized blue shoes, red nose, and painted face began to act all silly. The clown performed a series of rather funny and amusing acts, and he began to shape the long balloons into animals for all the children. Then the kids watched the clown finally place his face into a large cake and cover himself with all the cakey mucky goo, and pretty soon the kids, who needed no further encouragement, began throwing cake at each other in what I can only describe as a frenzied cake war. I suddenly remembered my son's fear of clowns, and I looked around frantically for him, as it was difficult to find my kid, as every kid was smothered in frosting. But as I surveyed the children, David was nowhere to be seen, and in that moment my heart was filled with an impending dread. I could feel the familiar nausea rising up in the back of my throat and taste that bitter bile on my tongue as feelings of dread engulfed me like a frozen current of icy water. As a mother, only one thought entered my head, and I immediately started seeing horrifying visions of the lake. I suddenly had the most dreadful impressions of my son's body floating limply on the surface of the lake, and in terror I threw off my heels and ran barefooted as fast as I could towards the lake, wearing a very impractical party dress. As I approached the lake, everything was very still, and the silvery projection across the water sparkled like a mirror that reflected the trees and the clouds in the sky on its gleaming surface. All seemed incredibly still, and I could even see a mother duck paddling in the water surrounded by her team of ducklings. Suddenly I saw the gold and blue party hat that my son had been wearing floating across the water, and my heart just sank. I immediately dashed into the water and started diving under the surface, feeling around for my son's body and calling out his name desperately. I could barely call out his name because the lump in my throat was just so big. I couldn't even cry. I kept diving and feeling around frantically for my son, and the sheer terror I felt suppressed my ability to scream. My hair was soaking and my wet dress clung to my body like a limp rag, and I continued to search the lake in a frantic frenzy. Suddenly I heard my son's voice saying, "Mammy, what you doing?" And I looked up to see my drenched son standing next to this curious creature that had her overlong hairy arm holding down his shoulder. The relief I felt in seeing my son overcame any inhibitions or anxiety that I may have had towards the creature, and I ran boldly towards my son, cradling him in my arms, as tears of relief poured out of my eyes. "Mummy," said my son, "I fell into the water, and the bear here, it rescued me." I looked up at the strange creature, and then reacted in a way I would have never imagined possible, and I ran instinctively towards the creature and threw my arms around her in a bear hug. Such was the extreme gratitude I felt towards her that I forgot about our physical differences in that moment, and maybe the joy I suppressed any reticence on my part. The trouble is my arms weren't long enough to reach around the creature's colossal torso, but she knew how happy I was and patted my back with her large hands in a reassuring way, as if she was saying, "It's all right, I do understand." She looked at me with a pair of deep-set golden eyes that were so congenial and kindly. She pointed to my son and the water, and then to herself, and mimed out to me exactly what had transpired. Her mime was so brilliant that I could tell that my son had wandered into the lake, tried to catch a fish that he had seen in the water, and as he stretched out to grab the fish, he had stumbled forwards, lost his balance, and fallen into the water. The creature observed what had happened and quickly dragged my son out of the water when she realized that he couldn't swim, and immediately rescued him. I had never seen a creature like this before, and at no time in North America was I aware of such a creature even existing or being reported about in science magazines like National Geographic or by the media, so I was flummoxed as to what it could be. I noticed the human characteristics were very clear to be seen in the face and in the body shape, but there were also primate influences that I detected in the bullet-shaped head, the prominent brow ridge on the forehead, and the overlong arms. The creature was much larger, powerful, muscular, and more agile than any man. It looked to me as if it had the abilities of orangutan, and I'm certain it would have the capability of balancing on a tightrope or on a high building without breaking a sweat, and never once losing its balance. This creature, although large and burly in stature, width and length, was so graceful and agile. If I was to estimate her size, I would easily put her at about 7 foot 600 pounds and 3 foot wide. I knew the creature was female, as her nature was instinctively maternal, protective and motherly, but she also had a pair of small hair-covered breasts, and her whole body was covered in long flowing hazelnut hair, which looked rather tangled and matted and well in need of a good brush, and I bet you once you brushed her hair it would have been glorious. The creature watched me curiously as I walked my son back to the party, where all the mothers gathered around me in horror when they saw my son and I drenched to the skin with water dripping off our bodies. Everybody gathered around us with concern, asking me what on earth had happened. I told them that my son was afraid of the clown and had run away in terror and fallen into the lake trying to catch a fish. But I never told anyone about the strange creature that I had encountered that had saved my son's life, because I knew my story would sound outrageous and incredulous, so I kept my lips firmly shut. The host kindly gave my son and I a change of clothes to wear, and everyone was so relieved that he was not a victim of a drowning. Our host told us that during the 1900s a young girl had actually drowned in that very same lake, and she told me that one evening late at night her husband had spotted the translucent figure of a young girl walking across the lake, and he's not the only eyewitness to this account. Imagine my amazement when my own son informed me that it was the terror of seeing the clown that made him run to the lake. And then he said he thought he saw a young girl waving to him, standing on the water, but he said that she just vanished before his eyes, so he was certain he had imagined her. It was then that his attention was diverted to a fish in the water, which he tried to catch, but failed. I was certain he might have observed the apparition of the girl that had died in the 1900s, as incredulous as that is to believe, as this sighting was during the day. I have no other rational explanation of what he saw, nor can I comprehend what I'd seen that day myself, for the creature was unlike anything that I'd ever encountered before. It was only in the late 2000s that I was to realise that the creature that I saw that day was a Bigfoot, and I am indebted to her all of my life as she saved my son from drowning that fateful day. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is George and I have an extraordinary Bigfoot encounter to share with you that happened in 2015, which I believe will amaze you and your listeners. The first time I actually heard this story from my uncle, I thought it was completely spurious because it seemed too incredulous and far-fetched to be true. I knew my uncle was telling the truth, though, because he's always been a man of extreme integrity. Even as a young boy growing up, my dad always recalled his brother being the one that was so honest that he would admit to stealing the cookies and peeking at the Christmas presents, when all the other siblings would remain deadly quiet and confess to nothing. I'm from Charleston in West Virginia, from a sumptuous, idyllic, green leafy neighbourhood, where I grew up in a pretty, very tasteful-looking grey Cape Cod-style home. My loving, close family was predominantly female, with 3 older sisters, so there were invariably occasions where my dad and I felt outnumbered by the woman, or if you like, excessive estrogen in our household. It was at times like this that my dad and I would enjoy escaping all that female energy as a united all-male duo. We would go whitewater rafting, camping, climbing, fishing, hiking and hunting together. I enjoyed spending time with my jovial, good-humoured and mellow father, who was an accomplished hunter and taught me everything that I know today. It would seem that under my father's proficient guidance and savvy instructions, I was becoming increasingly more accomplished as a hunter and had successfully managed to take down some big specimens of deer with sizable, rather impressive-looking racks, along with some smaller game. There are some animals I cannot shoot, and it's possibly due to the soppy, impressionable female influence that was birthed in me from being raised among a band of tender-hearted, diplomatic, and very tactful women. I believe their ascendancy has rubbed off me considerably and possibly sharpened the compassionate side of my character. I just happen to have a rather big soft spot for raccoons and squirrels, and I'm not embarrassed to admit it. You see, when I was a young boy, my sisters and I rescued a half-drowned baby raccoon and nurtured it back to health, and this creature was so gentle, docile and tender-hearted, not to mention very polite. It would literally perch on my shoulders behind my neck, and even eat out of my hand, reaching for its titbits with its dainty hand-like paws. Luckily, I'm glad to inform you that we were able to reintroduce it to the wild, but it did come back to visit us from time to time, and although wild, it was always comfortable in our presence, and sometimes even brought along a few of his wild friends to meet us, but they were much more skittish about our presence. Henceforth, I could never ever shoot one of those critters. I just have to see one of those fluffed-up striped tails ferreting around in a dustbin for an old doughnut, and I can see that I go mushy inside. As for the squirrels, they're also beautiful, curious, inquisitive, and comical, so killing them would be a bone of contention for me. Growing up, I was always a dab hand and very proficient with a fishing rod, and had managed to catch some sizable-looking bass and catfish, much to the delight of my mother, who adored to cook the tasty fresh fish that Dad and I caught in tons of butter, lemon juice, and oozles of garlic, and to serve it up to the entire family. It was always delectable, flaky and moist, and unlike anything you could get over the counter at Walmart. My strange, rather curious story begins when my uncle joined us for dinner one night, after we'd finished a delicious roast beef dinner with all the trimmings served by my mother, followed by very delicious, scrummy, large pieces of homemade apple pie served with lashings of thick clotted cream. My mother and sisters left the man to play cards together and to talk, and that was when my uncle said, in a rather nonchalant way, "Do you believe in Bigfoot?" At that my father raised a cynical brow and expressed his extreme doubt of any ape-like humanoid possibly living out here in North America, while I remained indifferent, although ever slightly sceptical, and open to being persuaded otherwise. "Well, he is definitely real," said my uncle. "I know it's hard to believe, but it's absolutely true, because I've seen him with my own eyes. Believe me, I was an unreformed skeptic myself, but in a second that doubt faded the moment I laid eyes on the critter." "What? Are you sure?" my father asked. "Was it not a case of misidentification? A bear, perhaps?" "Most certainly not," chided my uncle. "I saw that thing close up, and I'm not mistaken by what I saw. It was very definitely a Bigfoot." It was then that my uncle began to tell us an awe-inspiring phenomenal story, which I am going to share with you in his own words. By this time none of us were playing cards at all, and there was a stunned silence as my uncle began to talk. And this is what he told us. My good friend Larry and I were planning to go on our seasonal hunt in an area of national forest here in West Virginia. We decided to scout the area beforehand to find the very best spot to accomplish our goal. We found a favourable location where our blind would be inconspicuous and well concealed and seamlessly camouflaged, close to deer trails and fresh scat. We set up everything a couple of days earlier so that the deer became accustomed to the deer blind. I was absolutely certain that we were onto a winner in terms of our prime location, which I believed was exceedingly promising. I always get a thrill out of hunting with Larry, preferring never to hunt alone, as I appreciate and value Larry's companionship on these audacious excursions. Larry has been a firm friend of mine for many years, and our friendship goes far back to even when we were kids at elementary school, so I trust him implicitly with my life. Before a seasonal deer hunt, I get revved up like a race car engine, expending a surplus amount of energy on adrenaline, and always have done so for some very bizarre reason. I perpetually get this crazy buzz out of an intrepid adventure. Larry is a phenomenal partner because he is circumspect and pragmatic, and so he has the capability to calming down my heightened, rather rambunctious enthusiasm, which enables me to become grounded and focused on the job at hand. Without Larry's guidance, I would probably be a pretty lousy hunter because my heightened exuberance could affect my stability with the rifle. Imagine my bitter disappointment when Larry informed me he could not join me on the hunt, as his mother-in-law had been taken to hospital after suffering a mild stroke. He suggested I phoned up a friend of his who he believed would welcome a hunting adventure and was not a bad shot either with a rifle. To cut a long story short, word soon got around that I was looking for a hunting partner. I received a spontaneous phone call from a man called Marvin, who confessed that he'd love to go hunting with me. I had absolutely no idea who he actually was, but I assumed he was connected to Larry in some way, So I felt complacent and quietly confident that I was indeed in good hands. I could not have been more deluded and misled on this occasion, as little did I realise how unfortunate I would be to make this man's acquaintance. So it was on the day of the hunt at the crack of dawn I picked Marvin up from his home in Charleston. He looked like your quintessential run-of-the-mill hunter and was well kitted out with the top-of-the-range hunting regalia and all the correct camouflage jackets, pants and boots. He assured me he was an experienced hunter as he packed all his extensive hunting gear in the back of my Jeep. I did not immediately warm to this unpolished man, as his language was cursory and crude, and he was more than a little rough around the edges, even if I say so myself. I'm not a prude by any manner of means, but when a man begins to assassinate his own wife with foul, demeaning, offensive language, it's a bit of a red flag for me, and left me feeling distinctly uneasy and on edge about spending the rest of my day with this abrasive, boorish and uncouth man.
"She's bloody ugly," he told me, referring to his wife. "And when I say ugly, I mean ugly. When you get married, they should put a use-by date on your wife, with a warning that the battery's not going to last for very long, and it's likely to get rusty and worn out," he chuckled. I didn't laugh. No, his humour was very coarse, but instead I said, "Surely she has some redeeming qualities." "Redeeming?" he chuckled. "You haven't met my wife. She's lousy in every department. Reminds me of one of those pot-belly pigs. She puts her nose into everybody else's business, grunts when she talks, smokes like a chimney, eats like a hog, and dresses like a tent." "Now that's being very unkind," I said. "I'm sure she's not that bad." Before long the conversation changed and Marvin began to boast about his hunting prowess and the number of deer he'd taken down in a single shot over the years. I began to get the sense that this man had a nose as long as Pinocchio's and was prone to highly exaggerate his abilities, which I found more than a little irritating. Before long we settled down on the chairs in our hunting blind and waited for the day to unfold, like the parchment of a rolled-up scroll. It was a rarely magnificent morning with a still gentle breeze blowing in the air and the sound of cheerful birdsong in the valley. It wasn't long before some deer ambled our way and were even close to our blind, eating the turf and clearly oblivious to our presence. We both sat there, remaining very quiet and incredibly still, hardly daring to breathe, as things were looking exceedingly good. I knew I had selected an awesome location for the hunt, and judging by all the deer rambling close to our blind, I had hit pay dirt. It didn't get better than this for a hunter. These animals were young, and were certainly not sizable enough for Marvin, who was eager to take down a very large deer with a handsome rack, to gratify his arrogant, rather inflated ego, and to show off to his friends. Quite suddenly a whole herd of agitated deer came galloping down towards us from a high, rocky, mountainous ridge, and the way they were behaving was unusually strange. They looked apprehensive, anxious, and unduly alarmed. Although deer are usually skittish by nature, the nervous energy that they exuded and generated was feverish. They kept looking back nervously from the direction from whence they'd come, as if they believed that they were being pursued by a predator, or they had sensed something in the environment that had felt intrinsically wrong. "They're flustered about something," whispered Marvin, who was shaking excitedly as his beady brown eyes focused on an enormous deer with an impressive-looking rack that was looking up at the hillock very nervously as it twitched its white tail. "He's a beauty," whispered Marvin, focusing his rifle on the deer. "Look at that incredible, awesome rack. Now that's a rack if I ever saw one." All of a sudden, accelerating down the rocky embankment, was a shadowy, dark silhouette of a very huge man-like profile with a massive upper torso, overlong arms. He was running like a cheetah on a thunderous pair of powerful legs that literally caused the ground to vibrate beneath his weight as he glided towards the lower valley where we were actually hiding. It was the most colossal creature that I've ever seen in my entire life, and the deer began to dash away in a frenzied terror, making a desperate run for escape. I heard Marvin say, "Oh my God, a Bigfoot!" and the next thing I knew he was shuffling around in the back, looking for another rifle in his kit. He emerged from behind our hunting blind like a lumbering idiot and was positioning his rifle
and moving towards the Bigfoot that was now only standing yards away from us. Marvin looked like one of those crazy people that wanted to take on a predator. The Bigfoot stood very still when it realized it had been spotted by us, and looked rather bewildered and astonished to encounter us. At this point, Marvin had made his presence very clear. I think this critter was easily 8 foot tall, 600 pounds, and 3 foot wide, with the most colossal sized shoulders that I've ever observed, and it possessed a pyramid-shaped head that seemed to fold seamlessly into a pair of incredibly large shoulders with no real neck to speak of. I noticed that it was very streamlined and athletic-looking, with narrow hips and lean legs, which were powerful and incredibly strong. His taut, muscular, brawly body was covered with long, dark brown hair, and the creature smelt rather niffy, with a sweaty sneakers kind of smell about him. I noticed that the face on this creature was human-like but very grey in colour, and incredibly wrinkled, weathered and leathery. It had deep-set brown eyes that regarded us with a keen, curious interest, and in no way was he ever remotely aggressive towards us. At this stage all the deer had fled, as we had clearly sabotaged the Bigfoot's hunt, but he still remained gentle in his demeanour towards us, and did not even appear miffed that we had spoiled his hunt for him, which was incredible. Marvin was holding his rifle and aiming it directly at the Bigfoot. I remember saying to him, "Marvin, put your rifle down. The creature is not going to harm us." Sure enough, as I anticipated, the creature quickly turned around to retreat the way that he had come, towards the rocky ridge. At that moment, Marvin began to fire, and his firearm sounded like a machine gun going off. In that moment, I nearly jumped out of my skin, because the noise was deafening. It sounded like the sounds you get from war. What on earth was Marvin doing, I wondered in horror. I shouted for him to stop. "Marvin, stop! Marvin, stop!" But Marvin refused to listen. I watched in horror as he blew off the lower part of the Bigfoot's hand, and I saw it literally flying apart like pieces of shrapnel, with fingers propelled into the air like stray bullets, along with bone and flesh that had become like sharp splinters. I was to learn later that he had replaced his normal rifle on seeing that Bigfoot with a 50 BMG hollow point rifle, which can cause an enormous amount of sizable damage, and has been known to blow off human body parts before, like heads, legs and arms, and was thus a seriously lethal weapon to use, and frankly, in my opinion, outright nonsensical. I was absolutely furious. The poor, lofty, majestic-looking Bigfoot let out the most gut-wrenching, horrified, painful scream that turned my blood icy cold, and its painful cry still haunts my darkest nightmares even today. I observed him running, clutching his missing hand, and he was losing a lot of blood. I knew he must be in the most unbelievable, agonizing pain, and I was incandescent with rage. As far as I was concerned, Marvin's behaviour was duplicitous, murderous, and quite frankly revolting, because that critter was almost human. I was like a cauldron of hot water, boiling away on the stove and getting hotter and hotter and hotter. I was seething with an insatiable, foaming, livid anger that I just could not suppress. I really wanted to throttle Marvin, as his behaviour towards the benign Bigfoot was utterly despicable, abhorrent, deplorable, and nonsensical, and I immediately gathered my belongings together as I wanted to leave forthwith, and I shouted at Marvin. "What the heck did you do that for?" I said. "That creature was doing us no harm at all. What in God's name were you thinking? What you've done could have long-term repercussions for other well-meaning hunters. In the future, that Bigfoot might not be so benevolent towards humans, all because of you and your crazy actions." "We saw a Bigfoot," said Marvin, "and you're talking about repercussions. We have evidence now that the creature is real," he said as he began searching for the missing finger amidst the shrubbery and dry grassland for DNA evidence. "You're going to encourage Bigfoots to turn on humans," I said. "You're going to make them believe we're all thuggish and violent and aggressive like you. It's people like you that give humans a bad reputation, which could ultimately cost innocent lives. That's why people get attacked by Bigfoots, because you give us a bad reputation." "Stop being so melodramatic," said Marvin. "You're talking rubbish. It's all nonsense. It really is. Honestly.
Get a grip. Are you coming? I asked, looking exasperated, because I'm leaving now. I'm not sticking around in case the other Bigfoots in the area come after us to finish us off after what you've done. And quite honestly, who could blame them if they did? Don't be crazy, chuckled Marvin. That's not going to happen. Those critters aren't clever like us. That's where you're wrong, I said. Never underestimate a creature like that. I could sense it was highly intelligent and discerning. It could have attacked us and killed us if it wanted to, but it didn't. Only you turned on it in the way that you did, like a complete moron.
We saw Bigfoot, said Marvin, and you're talking about repercussions. We have evidence, real evidence now, that the creature is actually real, he said as he began to search for a missing finger amidst the shrubbery and dry grassland. You're going to encourage Bigfoots to turn on humans, I said. You're going to make them believe that we're all thuggish, violent and aggressive. It's people like you that give us humans a bad reputation, which will ultimately cost human lives, because Bigfoots will never trust us as a result of people like you. Oh, stop being so melodramatic, said Marvin. You're talking absolute nonsense. Look, said Marvin, after he'd been threshing and fiddling around the dry ground looking for remnants of the Bigfoot's hand. I found the Bigfoot finger, he said, holding up the big fat sausage-sized digit in his hand excitedly. I have all the evidence I need to prove to the world that Bigfoot is real. Imagine, he said, with a jubilant grin on his face, my name will be plastered all over the news. I'll go down in history as the first man to uncover Bigfoot DNA. I watched Marvin as he cradled the finger in his palm like a sausage, and I felt a surge of intense loathing towards this ignorant, foolish man as he hastily gathered his belongings together, which he slung over his shoulders while he gleefully examined his biological evidence, and followed me back to the car, where he began lagging behind considerably and failing to keep up with me. I didn't care, as I was walking as briskly as I could, because I wanted to get out of the area fast. I was too steamed up to engage in any conversation with Marvin, whom I was losing respect for every passing minute. Finally we got to my jeep, and I was settling down in the front seat and putting my keys in the engine to start the engine up, while Marvin was fumbling around and putting his hunting gear in the back of the boot, while I waited for him, somewhat impatiently, feeling very, very angry. Hurry up, I called. I'm not waiting forever. What's taking you so long? I could hear Marvin shuffling in the back of the boot, and then I heard a loud thumping sound and a little whimper, and then finally Marvin slumped on the seat next to me. He was shaking violently and whimpering like a frightened puppy. His eyes were as wide as saucers, and his face was as white as a sheet. To my absolute amazement, he was bleeding profusely, and his one arm looked shredded at the wrists, and I could see shattered bones and tissues hanging out of the arm, and his detached hand was being held by his left hand. It was the most grisly and gruesome sight that I've ever observed. If I hadn't known any better, I would have guessed that his hand had been dismembered by a shark, because it looked that messy and that revolting. What the heck happened to you? I asked in horror, reaching for my scarf to stop the bleeding, which I wound around the area to act as a tourniquet. Go, he screamed. Go! I need the hospital now. They need to attach my hand, or I'll lose the bloody thing. Now hurry up! The pain is killing me. It's excruciating. I was to learn that as Marvin had been placing all his gear in the back of my car, unbeknown to me, an irate female Sasquatch had bounded towards him so quietly that no one had heard a thing, not even me. The creature had taken him by surprise and lunged towards him, throwing him violently in the air, much like a frisbee, and had caught him halfway to cut his fall. Then she had grabbed his right hand and ripped it off his hand so violently, without much difficulty, with just a twist and a pull, and then she just glided away. I'd been sitting in the front seat, meditating on everything that had just transpired, without realizing that Marvin was being attacked only yards away from where I was sitting. I hadn't observed or heard a thing. Why did I not hear a thing? I asked in amazement. Because it happened so quickly. I was too shocked to scream. That's why, snapped Marvin. Now get moving. I'm dying here. I think you'll live, I assured him, as we drove to the hospital. Can you believe what that evil Bigfoot did to me? He complained on the journey. She only went and ripped off my hand, twisted it off with just a pull, just like a violent thug. Those Bigfoots are hellishly dangerous, and the whole lot of them need to be taken out. I'd do it myself if I could. Look, I said, it seems to me that the female Bigfoot was only doing to you what you did to that poor male Bigfoot. For all you know, she could have been his mother, or maybe his wife. You blew his hand off, and so she removed yours to get even with you. If you ask me, she was very lenient with you. Another Bigfoot might have finished you off and killed you on the spot. You're lucky to be alive, if you ask me. I told you what you did back there was foolish, and now you're paying the price for it. To cut a long story short, my uncle told us that Marvin underwent several extensive surgeries, but in the end he had to lose his hand completely because it was unable to be reattached, because some of the tissue had died and the bones had been so badly mangled that successful surgery was not going to be a viable option. I gather he told the doctors that a Bigfoot had actually attacked him and pulled and ripped and twisted off his hand, but his wife interceded and told them that her husband was the biggest liar, huge exaggerator, and not to believe a single word he said. He then told them that he actually had the evidence to wipe the smile off their faces, but then he realised that he'd actually lost the Bigfoot's finger. See, I told you he speaks hogwash, chuckled the wife. Wouldn't know the truth if it bit him in the face. That's my Marvin for you, she said, reaching out for his cheeks and pinching them. When Marvin asked my uncle to confirm that they had seen a Bigfoot together, my uncle answered, "I'm not saying anything." "See," said his wife, "you're trying to get this nice man to lie for you. That's my Marvin. He's always that deceptive." It transpired that after this altercation with the female Bigfoot, he must have lost the Bigfoot's finger when the critter had whirled him in the air, and in the end his biological evidence had gone missing, never to be found or seen again. My uncle informed us that he never returned to the spot to retrieve his chairs or his blind, because he was terrified of encountering the wrath of a revengeful Bigfoot, and who could have blamed him? When my uncle told us this story, my father and I listened with eyes as wide as saucers and mouths that hung to the floor. I knew my uncle was not one to make up stories, and so I emphatically believed him. "Why did the female Bigfoot not kill him?" said my father. "I would have done so in her shoes. The man behaved like a maniac." Fast forward a couple of years, and I was at a barbecue with friends on a beautiful summer evening, and I began talking to a couple of young men who had been hunting in the same area of National Forest where my uncle initially went hunting 2 years prior. Imagine my shock when the man told us that he had observed a male Bigfoot crossing his path hurriedly. He said their eyes met, and then the creature scampered away and kept looking at his hands as if checking to see if he was holding a rifle. It seemed incredibly anxious and fearful, he said. "Get this," he said, "the Bigfoot was missing its right hand." I remember relief flooded over me as I realised it must be the same Bigfoot that Marvin had shot, and I was so happy to know that he had fully recovered from his injuries. But I doubt he will ever forget what happened to him, and he possibly feels that humans can never be trusted, and who can blame him? I decided to visit the same area of National Forest where the men claimed to have seen a handless Bigfoot, and as I'm a great artist, I used my art to communicate with the creatures. I painted a picture of a Bigfoot losing his hands to a man with a gun. Then I painted another picture of a man that looked different to the man with the gun, holding a huge box of goodies and fruit and handing them to the Bigfoot who had lost his hands. It was my way of saying sorry and making amends, as if saying, not all humans in the world are like this. I bought a massive box of goodies which included everything Bigfoots are supposed to like, based on my research, including Kit Kats, peanuts, salted chips, raisins, biscuits, cooked bacon slices, bananas, grapes, mangoes, nectarines, dried fruit bars, and jerky. I placed the large box covered with yellow and white balloons on a tree in the area and left it there. I hoped that way it would be conspicuous to the Bigfoot, and I prayed with all my heart that he would find it, and somehow in my gut I feel that he did. It takes a couple of bad apples like Marvin in the hunting world to contaminate the whole barrel, which is incredibly unfortunate because many hunters are incredibly amazing people. If some people have encountered a very aggressive Bigfoot, could it be that the critters encountered a hunter like Marvin before and regard our human species as pretty contemptible? I think the answer could very well be yes. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Tom and I'm from Washington State, and my Bigfoot encounter happened when I was about 28 years old in about 1997. I grew up in a delightful neighbourhood where the properties were situated quite close together on reasonable-sized front and back yards that were flanked on the right-hand side of the valley by a vast area of natural woodland that was a haven for the natural indigenous wildlife. This sumptuous, dreamy woodland area was very popular for us to frequent as kids because it possessed open hiking trails for walkers and cyclists that were well maintained by the Forestry Commission. It would seem that most of the local residents enjoyed walking their dogs in this lush, pristine area of forest with its statuesque, imposing trees that towered into the blue firmament like emerald giants and were layered with luxurious carpets of velvety moss. Not to mention the forest floor, which was covered with trailing ferns and lavish, profuse ground cover. It was an idyllic place to grow up, because everyone was very friendly and congenial, and as kids we would spend our time interacting with all the local kids, where we would ride our bikes down the forest trails and play hide-and-seek together. In those days our parents tended to be much more relaxed about us playing out of doors, as it was an area that appeared to have a zero crime rate, and we felt incredibly safe. There were a couple of old Victorian houses, an Edwardian home, several ranch-style houses, and some more modern-looking contemporary homes in our street, all with yards filled with colourful seasonal flowers, terraced gardens, manicured hedges, and pristine lawns of lush green resplendent turf. I grew up in a spacious ranch-style home with my mother and dad and my older brother Billy. While my mother was staying at home taking care of us, my father worked as an attorney in Seattle, which was about 45 minutes' drive from where we lived at the time. In a strange way, the story I'm going to tell you that ultimately led to my incredulous Bigfoot encounter began when a tiny seed was sown, when I was about 10 years old at the time, which unbeknown to me would ultimately turn the chords of fate like the hands of a clock until the moment was ripe for me to ultimately meet the hairy man who would leave an indelible mark on my life forever. It was on one peaceful Friday afternoon that I was riding my bike along a very peaceful, serene road where we lived, when quite suddenly my bicycle lost traction, and I went colliding into a tree and was propelled off my bike and thrust onto the grassy pavement, where I landed with an almighty thud, cushioned only by a few tufts of green grass. In that moment I became mindfully aware that I had indeed broken my leg. I remember my leg was throbbing painfully, and I noticed that it was not aligned correctly. For a moment I sat there on the grass verge, looking rather dazed and bewildered, in a stupendous silence, as I began to assimilate the shock of what had just transpired. In that second, a beautiful girl about the same age as myself, with strawberry blonde hair, porcelain skin, and blue eyes, who had been playing in the front yard at the time, came running towards me. She was wearing a long white cotton frock, and her long hair blew gently in the breeze. It would seem that she had only just moved into the Victorian house on our street, and I had never ever laid my eyes on her before. When she emerged from that house like a blue-eyed angel, I remember thinking that she was the prettiest girl that I had ever laid my eyes upon, and in that second I was smitten. "Are you all right?" she asked me earnestly. "I heard a loud crashing sound. Did you fall off your bike?" "I'm afraid so," I said. "I think I've broken my leg." "Does it hurt?" she asked, looking rather worried. "I'm afraid it does. Quite a bit, actually," I said. The girl bent over to examine my leg. "I think you're right. Your leg is very definitely broken. Don't move. I'm going to get help right now. I'm Emma, by the way. I've only just moved into the Victorian house over there," she said, pointing to the pale blue home. "It's number 85. What number house is yours?" 75, I said. As she scurried away, I remember thinking, wow, 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 she's so bewitchingly beautiful. Before long, the girl's mother came bustling out of the house, and she bore an uncanny resemblance to her daughter, with the same flawless porcelain skin, sparkling blue eyes, and ravishingly beautiful long strawberry blonde hair. "Are you all right?" she asked me, with a note of deep concern in her voice. "Emma told me that you've broken your leg. What rotten bad luck. Listen, I've called 911 and the emergency services, and they're on their way, she assured me. But Emma's gone to call your mother for you. Before long, I was transported to hospital with my mother by my side, who was holding my hand with a desperately concerned look on her face. Mum, I'll be fine, I assured her. Please stop worrying. I've only broken a leg. I wasn't run over by a bus. Even so, darling, protested my mother, I wish to goodness sake you would be a little bit more careful on that bike of yours. You do tend to be rather rambunctious and reckless on it, if you don't mind me saying. You're getting to yourself into all kinds of scrapes and troubles at the moment. In a twinkling of an eye, I had left the hospital, where I was fitted with a rather impressive-looking white cast that I hobbled around on for a few weeks while my leg healed. I did get a visit from Emma and her mother once, when they spontaneously turned up my house out of the blue to ask how the patient was doing. They brought me a big balloon that said, "Get well soon," and a magnificent box of the most delicious chocolates. I remember they were wrote on my cast, and Emma wrote, "Get better soon, and don't fall off any more bikes again, because I may not be there to rescue you next time." And then she put, "Love, Emma." I treasured her message more than anybody else's. After my bicycle accident, I sadly never saw much of Emma again, because she never seemed to interact or play with the local kids in the area. I found out that she had a very strict disciplinarian father who did not let her out of his sight for a moment, and I sensed that the rumours that circulated about her must indeed be true. I remember thinking, what a bummer. I longed to get to know the mysterious, beautiful, strawberry-blonde girl at number 85 Forest Road a whole lot better. I did see her a couple of times in passing me on the street when I was riding my bicycle. She was in her family's BMW, and she would wave at me from the car and smile at me through the window. I remember thinking, that's the girl I want to marry one day when I'm all grown up. When I was about 15 years old, we left our family home in Forest Road and moved into a neighbourhood 15 minutes away from Seattle, as it was much more convenient for my father from a work point of view or perspective. We moved into a really vibrant up-and-coming area, bustling with restaurants, coffee shops, pretty little local shops, a bakery, a butcher and a delicatessens, literally only a heartbeat away from where we lived. For a teenage boy, it was an exciting, thrilling and energising place to live, and I enjoyed the benefits of living in this bustling, thriving community with all kinds of indoor and outdoor pursuits. Fast forward to about August of 1997, and by this time I was 28 years old and had been through a series of tumultuous relationships with several young women over the years that had never worked out, because I always seemed to date women who were so intense and exceedingly possessive, which began to be a rather big issue for me. At this stage of my life, I was living in my own apartment, and I was working as a policeman in the local area, and I was really enjoying my job in the local community, and had met so many interesting congenial people, as well as your usual vagrants, drug addicts and drunks, which was a commonplace problem among the police officers on duty, having to deal with, including, of course, domestic disputes, local brawls, and other emergency scenarios, which I'm sure you can imagine. I received a call one night at about 11 o'clock that was an intruder trying to break in. "Not to worry, ma'am," I said politely. "You go back into your house and I'll check the premises for you to see if anybody's out here." "Could you check the tall evergreen conifers in the backyard, officer?" said the young woman. "The perpetrator could be hiding out there. It's densely thicketed, I'm afraid. I'm not sure whether someone is trying to scare me as some kind of a sick practical joke, or if in fact there is a man trying to break in because he knows I'm all on my own and sees me as a sitting duck." "I'll check everything," I assured her. I began to walk around the house with my flashlight, examining the whole area, and recently there had been a great deal of rain in Washington, and so I was pretty certain that I might find some evidence or footprints, and I was not wrong. I observed some muddy footprints trailing around Emma's home, especially outside her kitchen wall. These footprints were easily 16 inches long, and they just seemed way too big for a natural man. I mean, they were colossal in size. If that wasn't odd enough, the individual loitering around the Victorian house had been patrolling the place in his bare feet, without wearing any shoes, which was weirder still. It was decidedly odd, but it was clear to me that someone had indeed been snooping around the property. But who or what, I could not imagine. The only thing that could have feet this large was a bear, but that idea was preposterous as the footprints were distinctly humanoid, with very clear toe imprints, and so it was utterly peculiar, and I was flummoxed by what I was observing. As I got to the front door, it was flung open by the young woman who said to me, "Officer, did you find anything? I'm so terribly concerned." "I'm afraid I did, ma'am," I told her. "There were some very large footprints outside the front of your home, especially behind your kitchen wall, and also a few smudge marks on the wall outside your kitchen, as well as on the windows, which does indeed suggest that someone has been loitering around in the living areas of your home. The good news is I actually believe the perpetrator has finally left the premises, because there is no sign of anyone around on your property right now." "Officer, I don't feel safe," she told me, looking anxious. "What if he comes back?" she asked awkwardly. "Don't worry," I reassured her. "I'll keep patrolling the area as I'm on duty tonight, and I'll be keeping my eyes fixed on your home, and I'll make absolutely certain that you're fine." "Thank you, officer. I'm so grateful," she said. The lady looked at me and suddenly said, "Have I met you before?" she asked. "You look strangely familiar to me, but I can't quite place you. Have we met somewhere before?" I grinned. "I remember you," I told her. "Very well, actually." "Do you remember helping a little boy who'd fallen off his bike over there?" I said, pointing to the grassy verge on the opposite side of the road. "No," she gasped, covering her mouth with astonishment. "You're not him." "It's true," I said. "It's me." "You've got to come in now," she said. "You're Tom, is that right? I do remember you very well. You were always getting yourself into scrapes and all kinds of trouble. I remember writing on your leg cast," she said, giggling. "Nothing's changed much," I said. "You're Emma, right? You remember?" "How could I forget?" I chuckled. "Not every boy gets rescued by a beautiful strawberry blonde girl with sparkling blue eyes when they break a leg." Before long I was chatting away with Emma in her kitchen as she scurried around heating up milk and making us big mugs of hot chocolate, which she sprinkled with marshmallows and topped with delicious whipped cream. "If you're going to have hot chocolate," she giggled, "it's got to be decadent, chocolatey, and very naughty, with tons and tons of calories." I remember that our conversation just flowed seamlessly as we chatted away like old friends. I'd never felt this comfortable talking to a woman before, but with Emma the conversation was easy and uninhibited. I was to learn that Emma had not played with the local kids as a girl, because her father was a very authoritarian, draconian kind of man, who insisted that she studied and refused to let her play outdoors, so it appeared that the rumours about her were indeed true. "You know, he was a headmaster of a local school," she told me. "He ran our household in the same uncompromising, pertinacious way he took charge of that school. I do not know why my mother put up with my dad. He was awfully difficult, you know. He was very old school, stringent and pretty bull-headed, if the truth be told. He was a lot older than my mother. I think there was a 25-year-old age difference between them both, which I think proved challenging for my mother later on." "Wow, that is a big age gap," I reflected. "Is he still around, your dad, I mean?" "No, he died about 5 years ago," said Emma, taking a sip of her chocolate. "Now this is what I call a good hot chocolate," she said. "Oh, I did love my dad, you know, but when he died I felt almost as if I'd been set free. Does that sound really terrible?" "Of course you did," I said. "You were no longer being ruled by a rod of iron, and you felt like a caged bird that could finally fly again. I can't blame you for that." "Does that sound terrible," she said, "to be talking like that about my late dad?" "Of course not," I said. "What about your mother? Where is she now?" "Oh, she's gallivanting around on a cruise liner with her tall, dark, sultry, handsome lover, who's 15 years her junior." "So she likes her men older or a whole lot younger," I teased, "but never men who are the right age for her." "You would be right about that," laughed Emma. Suddenly she coughed and sniffed. "Oh, sorry about that," she said. "You must excuse me if I'm sniffing," she exclaimed. "I've recently been getting lots of stuffy, congested headaches and flu-like symptoms. I've also had the occasional dizzy spell and 1 or 2 fainting attacks. I even had moments that I couldn't remember things. Would you believe it, I actually put the dirty laundry into the freezer rather than the washing machine. You know, I really thought I had some serious lifelong impediment, like a degenerating disease of some sort, but I was informed by the doctor that I was absolutely fine. As ironic as it sounds, I felt a little phony at the doctor's because at my appointment my symptoms just vanished. Well, that's typical, I said. He said I obviously had a seasonal cold, but I don't seem to be getting any better, despite all the medications he's given me. If anything, all that paracetamol is making my condition a lot worse. Maybe you need to see another doctor, I suggested. I always believe it doesn't hurt to get a second opinion. After our conversation, I assured Emma I would patrol the place every hour, but if she wanted me to stay over at her premises to watch over the place, I would happily sleep on the sofa. I can do better than that, she said. I can put you up in the spare room upstairs if you like, and I'd love you to stay if you didn't mind. You see, if the intruder sees there's a man around the place, then hopefully he'll be scared away. Maybe I'm being harassed because I'm all on my own, and I'm an easy target while my mother's away. And so it was that on this very evening I brought my overnight suitcase with me and moved into the spare room of Emma's Victorian home. I was feeling very animated and excited because not only was Emma so beautiful, but she was such an incredible person, and I could feel that I was falling for her in a big way, and there was a very evident chemistry between us, or a spark if you like. I was pleased to have an excuse to be staying at her home, which was the perfect opportunity to get more acquainted with this mysterious, remarkable woman. I noticed at the moment that I moved into Emma's home that I felt that the air in her house seemed stuffy and oppressive, and I began to acquire the same flu-like symptoms that Emma had. I was surprised at my appalling immune response, because I was never one before to succumb to the cold. Before long, we were both convinced that I'd caught her flu. I felt so unwell that I actually called off sick at the station. We spent the time together watching television, ordering takeouts, eating popcorn and drinking hot chocolate and making all kinds of flu remedies together for ourselves, but nothing seemed to work for us. "It's a nasty flu," said Emma, "because it just won't go away, and I can only apologise for passing it on to you." That evening, as Emma and I were watching television and I was falling asleep on the couch, I was awoken to Emma shaking me violently. Her eyes were as wide as saucers, and her skin had grown a deathly pale colour. "He's back," she said. "The intruder's back. Can you hear all the banging around the house? It's so scary." I was feeling very sluggish, tired and very woozy, and I almost stumbled as I made it out of the front door, due to being disorientated and dizzy. What the heck was wrong with me, I wondered, as I seemed incapable of focusing. Once I was breathing the fresh air, I seemed to revive and feel a whole lot better, and even sturdier on my feet. After gathering my bearings, I observed a dark, shadowy silhouette, standing only yards away from where I was, and at first I thought it was a bear. What the heck, I thought. Was I hallucinating or something? I immediately shone my flashlight on the creature, and I nearly dropped it in shock. Now I knew I had to be hallucinating. Maybe it was a side effect of the flu medication, I thought, because this thing I was looking at could not possibly be real. There was no way. I shone my torch back on the critter and stared at it in a stupefied silence. To my amazement, the creature didn't run away at all, but seemed to stare at me for a moment, and I got the very real sense he was trying to communicate to me. He kept pointing to the house with his overlong arm and then touching his flat pug-like nose. Again and again he kept doing this. I had never observed a critter like this before, nor had I heard any documented accounts of such a creature existing here in North America, so what it was, I couldn't imagine. The critter was humanoid in shape, much like a man but built like a giant, and the torso area of his body bore an uncanny resemblance to the great ape. It was taut with sinewy muscle definition and overlong arms, powerful lean strong legs, and a narrow waist. The creature possessed a large bullet-shaped head that seamlessly blended into the massive shoulders, and when I say massive, they were gargantuan, with no real evidence of a neck to speak of. The whole body was covered with long median-length brown hair, similar in colour to a black bear, but the hair was more like the length of a long-haired German shepherd dog. I'm quite certain the critter was at least 8 foot tall, possibly more, about 750 pounds, and about 3 foot wide. The critter's face was rather human-like in appearance, with a prominent, very distinctive brow ridge that was deeply furrowed, with lots and lots of wrinkles. The skin looked leathery, and it also looked rather weathered. The eyes were deep-set and dark, with some red eye-shine, and the mouth was somewhat rather narrow. I stared at the critter in a stupefied awe. I was too astonished to be afraid of it, because my fears were suppressed and temporarily bypassed by my complete incredulity of what I was actually seeing, for indeed the creature was without doubt one of the most powerful, lofty, majestic, magnificent and intelligent creatures that I have ever encountered. I could tell that the critter meant me absolutely no harm, as his demeanour was very kindly and very gentle towards me, without the remotest hint of aggression. I can assure you that if the creature had been hostile towards me, I would have been petrified out of my skin. Of that I am in no doubt, because even to look at, he seemed incredibly intimidating and very scary. What was the creature trying to tell me, I wondered? He kept pointing over and over again to the kitchen area of the house, tapping at the Pacific area of the wall and touching his nose. He even went up to the wall and put his nose directly on the spot. He repeated the same strange mannerisms a few times. It was all very mystifying, and then I watched in amazement as the creature glided away, moving its overlong arms backwards and forwards, as if it was marching with 5-foot strides, and his movements were so fluid, flawless and graceful, and I remember thinking, wow, what an incredible, majestic creature that is. "Did you see anything?" asked Emma, as I returned into the house. "No, nothing," I said, "nothing at all," as the last thing I wanted to tell her was about the strange critter that I'd encountered, and scare her half to death in the process. As I entered the house, I suddenly sensed that the house felt very stuffy and muggy, and then it suddenly hit me like a bolt of electricity or a beacon of light lighting up a lighthouse at sea for the lost sailors on their fishing boats to guide them back to safety. "Do you have a gas boiler?" I asked Emma. "Of course," she said, "over there in the kitchen." To my horror, in exactly the same location that the creature had been tapping with his giant-sized hand and touching with his nose, was a gas boiler, and it appeared to have a yellow-brown stain around the boiler, and the blue flames seemed to flicker with a very definite yellow light. That was a distinct warning bell to me. "Pack some clothes immediately," I said to Emma, as I began opening windows all over the place. "You're coming to stay at my home right now." "What are you doing?" asked Emma. "Get your things," I snapped, "and hurry, quick." To cut a long story short, I called a gas-safe service engineer to look at Emma's boiler, and as I suspected, it had been leaking a tiny bit of carbon monoxide, which the gas engineer told me could have become lethal in a couple of days as the boiler was beginning to leak very badly. I realised we were incredibly lucky to be alive, and I believe that the hairy critter had sensed the problem, either physically, telepathically or vibrationally, with extrasensory ability, and was trying to get us to address it, which was why it kept tapping on Emma's windows. If it was not for the creature, I'm pretty certain we would definitely be dead. As you can imagine, like all love stories, mine definitely ends very happily. But I'm not a man who sits on his laurels, because 6 months after I met Emma, I proposed to her. I could have done it on the first night, but I knew it was better to wait. So I proposed to her at a beautiful location in Washington, overlooking the Silvery Lake. And I'm glad to say that this stunning strawberry blonde-haired woman said yes. All these years later, we are still very happily married and so much in love. And we both live in the old blue Victorian house together with our 2 teenage children. I never told Emma nor my children about the Bigfoot I encountered that night, and I really don't know why. For some reason it was a subject I didn't want to share, and being a police officer I was less likely to talk about such strange anomalies to other officers, for fear of being typecast or being ridiculed. I also believe when you have an encounter like this, it's so deeply personal and incredibly special. It's not something that you want to tell anybody about, not even your own wife. And you can only possibly understand this conundrum if you experience an encounter with Bigfoot yourself. I thought I would share this with you, though, and your listeners, in this anonymous forum, as I really think you might appreciate hearing this story. I now know that the creature I encountered was indeed a Bigfoot, and for some reason I think they seem to have some kind of extrasensory perception, or maybe they can smell things we cannot detect. I think some of these creatures seem to have a vested interest in helping humanity. I gather that the Indians believe this to be the case and left offerings for the creatures outside the forest. More recently, my younger son did ask me if I actually believed in Bigfoot, and I told him I most certainly did. He asked me why, and I told him that we can never be sure what's out there. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.